Jay. And we got another great, exciting episode in the loins of history where we're going to connect the history of the past to current events of today. We're going to continue on our series about the history of Chinese and U.S. relations. And if you remember last week, we were talking about the beginning of the Chinese Civil War with the fracture and conflict between the CCP and the KMT, starting with the Shanghai Massacre and ending with the Long March. And today we're going to pick it up actually in the Second Sino-Japanese War beginning in 1937. So with that being said, we got a lot to talk about. It's going to be a really, really interesting episode. Jay, what are some of the key takeaways we have?
Awesome. Thanks, Colin. We have three key takeaways this episode. Number one, the Second Sino-Japanese War, and for our American friends, that's part of World War II. The Second Sino-Japanese War.
Thank you for clarifying that. I felt like when I was reading it off the notes, like this, people are going to be like, wait, hold on. What war was this? That's almost World War II.
I love self-deprecating humor. We love America. All right. The Second Sino-Japanese War was a major turning point in the history of U.S.-Chinese relations because it was the first time that the United States had made significant steps to actually enforce the open door policy. Prior to that, the open door policy was just kind of on paper. Number two, the U.S. effectively ended its relationship with Japan and eventually went to war with Japan in order to enforce the open door policy. We'll kind of explain how Americans kind of just see the U.S. and Japan on this collision course independent of China, when in fact, if there wasn't conflict between Japan and China, there would not have been conflict between the U.S. and Japan, and we'll talk about that. And then number three, Japanese war atrocities that began during this time still have an impact on Asian relations between Japan, Korea, and China and elsewhere. Still have impact on relations, and the U.S. still has to navigate those touchy subjects today. It's still like very much an issue, cannot be overstated.
Jay, can you? Last week we ended with the ending of the Long March and kind of where things stood in 1936. But I think for this week's episode, we kind of got to go back to the Manchurian crisis and Japanese aggression. Right. I think I mentioned it in 1931 with Japan invading Manchuria, but do you want to start with us there? Because I think that's kind of sets the stage for this Second Sino-Japanese War.
Yeah, let's paint the picture. I think I've talked about before. Visual person, have to see like the map in my mind to understand what's going on, right? So there were two different major crises in the 30s that kind of got the map to where it was in 1937 when the Second Sino-Japanese War kicked off. The first one was in 1931. So you had the Imperial Japanese Army hanging out in Korea, hanging out in the Liaodong Peninsula with designs on Manchuria. Japan already had extensive economic interests in Manchuria. They were operating lots of different railways. They were these railways were facilitating Japanese, intra-Japanese Manchurian / Chinese trade, and they were protecting these railroads. Well, one of the favorite things that the Japanese army at that time, the Imperial Japanese Army, liked to do was kind of manufacture these incidents or these crises. And they would do it. I mean, they did it over and over and over and over again for like 50 years in this area. And then something would happen and they would go, oh, we got to invade. We got to take over. The Russians would do the same thing, by the way. So this happened in 1931 where this crisis occurred over a railroad and the Japanese invade. Well, they don't like annex all of what's known as Manchuria, but rather they established a puppet government. We talked about this a little bit in our last episode, but they set up the last emperor of the Qing dynasty, a guy named Pu Yi, who at this time had become an adult, and they set up the puppet state of Manchukuo. There was like this declaration of Manchurian independence from the KMT and from China on the whole. And the Japanese were like, look at what we're doing, and they're couching it in terms that were national self-determination. These people want to be independent, blah, blah,
which
blah.
Which is a very, if you remember, we talked about this when we went over the history of political parties, when we started discussing like Woodrow Wilson, like this was a big push, like the idea of self-determination was very popular with Woodrow Wilson post World War I, kind of, hey, we've had these empires that are now breaking apart and people are allowed to self-determine. So they were just using popular political speak, if you will, I think, when you say that.
Yeah. Maybe one day we'll do a series on just Japan because it's fascinating to see like why Japan was doing the things that they were doing during this time because I was, in doing research for this episode, seeing Westerners claim like, oh, Japan wanted, like they saw Great Britain and French empires and they wanted an empire too. And I don't, maybe not disagree, but just try to qualify those statements a little bit and say like, there's no way Eastern culture wants this Western style imperial like ideas. Like they're not they never had this common background of the Roman Empire. Japan didn't have like a humongous sprawling empire that they were trying to reclaim, which is true for Europe. A lot of the European empires at different times and in different places were claiming some type of historical continuity with the Roman Empire.
Literally every one of them. When we talked about Russia, Tsar, Caesar, Reich, basically the third Rome, Moscow's the third Rome. Everybody has an eagle. Look in Washington, D.C. at our architecture. It's extremely Roman in nature.
Right.
We're all Westerners all go back to Rome. So yeah,
Japan. Yeah, Japan didn't have that. So it's not as simple as, Japan just wanted an empire. I mean, I'm not a Japanese scholar, but Jay's 2 cents is that it probably has something. It has something to do with these imperial Japanese generals. They harken back to the period of the samurai and the daimyos, which dominated, like that was around in Japan for a long time. These independent warlords who would go and kind of just spread their influence wherever. And these generals, that's kind of who they saw themselves as. So if you're a general hanging out in southern Manchuria and Korea, you think of yourself as like an independent daimyo. They're not trying to expand like Japan per se as much as they're just trying to like get glory for themselves. I don't know.
That does make sense.
I digress.
Jay, I
getting way off topic here.
I don't want to go. I'm going to get off topic again, but kind of on topic a little bit. I don't know. We're going to go a different direction. While you're talking about this crisis, it kind of dawned on me, like if we're going to take an example of this in modern day, it almost looks like the Russia crime. This is kind of like Russia Crimea in 2014, where it's sort of like, hey, we are going to claim this as Russia. We're going to annex it. Mm-hmm. And, obviously we see, so this happened in 1931. 6 years later, they invade completely. It's kind of like with Russia. It's like, well, they annexed Crimea. They just stacked up troops on the border. They obviously had interest in the Donbass region. They sort of had these little proxy campaigns going on. It was almost like everyone should have known that they were going to invade shortly thereafter. It just kind of, these look very, very similar in that the U.S. in 1931 really didn't have a historical context to look at and say, hey, we know this means that there's an invasion coming, but they should have. At least in now, we can look and say, well, yeah, the Russians were obviously going to invade Ukraine. It was a matter of time.
No, you're right. I thought at first I was going to disagree with you and say and say, when Russia invaded Crimea in 2014, Crimea for a really long time was in fact part of Russia. And when they took it from the Tartars in the Crimean Khanate, like several hundred years ago, as opposed to Manchuria, which was never Japanese. There's like no cultural linguistic continuity with Japan. So it was different. However, what I think you were saying, and correct me if I'm wrong, but yes, like 1931 and 1935, what happened in 1935 was Japan continued to take more territory. And actually they created another puppet state, called Menguko or something like that. Mm-hmm. And they actually annexed some territory right next to Beijing. So they further expanded their Manchurian possessions even beyond Manchukuo, which is what the Puyi and that puppet government controlled. And yeah, to your point, it's like, come on, guys, like if Japan doesn't learn its lesson, it's not going to stop. In the same way that when Russia took over Crimea in 2014, like it just essentially received a slap on the wrist. It's not going to stop.
That was the point I was trying to make. Obviously, right. There's different cultural reasons, but yeah. And, I guess I had never really put this together until I was researching this, and I just typed in, I was like, Manchurian candidate, like where does that? It's basically a puppet political leader. People have probably seen the movie or read the book, but like that's after Puyi in the Manchukuo dynasty. The Manchurian candidate. I did not know that. I just put I was like, Manchurian candidate. It's like, oh yeah, it's a puppet political leader. Oh, that was exactly what Puyi was. He was just propped up by the Japanese. And I was like, oh, it makes sense now that those two things are connected.
Yeah, I didn't know that about the Manchurian candidate, but it makes a lot of sense. So just to kind of real quick to continue setting the stage. So after 1935, the Japanese control all of Manchuria through Manchukuo, and they're like on the border of Beijing province, not necessarily, at the gates of the city itself, but they're really close. They're also in like northern China, right on the border of Shaanxi province. That all happened in 1935. The United States, up until that point, had not done like any real punitive measures. There have been a lot of diplomatic naughty Japan, don't do that. This isn't in our interest. However, America was also couching its condemning rhetoric still in protecting only American interest terms. So America also still had growing business enterprise in China and in Japan. And we were also still very concerned about our missionaries. We had a lot of missionaries still in northern China and elsewhere. And we wanted to make sure the Japanese and all these conflicts weren't, harming the actual U.S. persons, either businessmen or missionaries. And we wanted to protect their freedom to go do that. And we didn't want the Japanese to get involved. We didn't want the Japanese to harm them. So that's kind of where we were at in 1935. Japan's still growing, but there's not really any serious mechanisms, at least from the United States, to ensure that Japan doesn't keep expanding. The lesson that Japan is learning in 1935 is the cons of damaging our relationship with the United States is still worth further expansion into China. And that brings us to 1937 and the Marco Polo Bridge Incident. All right, so Marco Polo Bridge Incident. This is, we were just talking about Japanese manufactured crises. And there's this river outside of Beijing in 1937 and a bridge. It is exactly how it sounds. The Marco Polo Bridge. And there was these skirmishes were started between Japanese and Chinese soldiers. Can't say definitively who started it. Most people kind of assume it was the Japanese, only because they have a history of trying to start stuff. So after the skirmish starts, the Imperial Japanese Army just goes off on a full-blown assault. And they end up very quickly they take the city of Beijing, and they take the major port city of Tianjin, really to the southeast of Beijing. For our listeners, remember our Boxer Rebellion episode. Tianjin is where the Seymour expedition came in. That's where all the 8 nations were bringing in their troops. So it's right there next to Beijing. This incident and this huge battle that ensues, where Japan basically takes over all of Beijing province, sparks a big international outcry. And this is when the U.S. kind of goes, okay, this is the beginning of the Second Sino-Japanese War. We start seeing some sanctions, some minor stuff on particular Japanese individuals and businesses. The Japanese had already left the League of Nations, and it's not like the U.S. was a part of that anyway. So the League of Nations couldn't really do very much. And this kind of ended both the League of Nations, because people completely lost confidence that could do anything. It also ended, if we listen, or if we remember our last episode, or 2 episodes ago, the 1922 Nine Power Treaty. That was the treaty where Japan was one of the 9 powers that affirmed the open door policy. And early letters from the U.S. Secretary of State in 1937 was yo, you guys need to pull out of Japan, go back to the 1937 borders, and reaffirm the Nine Power Treaty. And Japan just didn't respond. So this is the end of the Nine Power Treaty. This is the end of the League of Nations. And now we have the beginning of the Second Sino-Japanese War.
I think it's kind of interesting. So at the start of the Second Sino-Japanese War, to look at the relations between the CCP and the KMT at this point, we kind of left off right here last week. And if you remember, after the Long March, the CCP moved kind of north and west and occupied very rural areas, but large landmass, but very rural. And the KMT occupied mostly cities in and around Beijing, Nanjing, places like that. Chiang Kai-shek had a very anti-CCP stance. And up until this point, he actually focused almost all his energy against the CCP instead of the Japanese. I think there's some differing reports, but a lot of people believe that he didn't think that the Chinese could stop the Japanese, the KMT by itself. So he wanted to eliminate the CCP, and then that was his idea for unification: was eliminate the CCP, bring them back into the fold of the nationalist Chinese, then fight the Japanese. There was actually an incident where some of his generals, who were super disgruntled because they saw, and this is before the actual Sino-Japanese War broke out, but they actually saw the Japanese as this massive threat, and they're like, hey, you have to become allied with the CCP in order for us to stop the Japanese. They're the bigger threat. And a lot of the Chinese people believe the same thing. They were more concerned about the Japanese coming in versus the CCP. So Zhang Juliang, I think I pronounced that correctly, and Yang Hucheng they were 2 of his top generals in the KMT. They actually kidnapped him for 2 weeks and essentially forced him into this kind of name-only treaty with the CCP. And in that name-only alliance, it was called the Second United Front, where they would stop their fighting and create this allied front against the Japanese. And it's important to note that the KMT, because if you remember, Chiang Kai-shek was born and raised really he was raised throughout the military and even studied in Japan. So he was a hard military man, and he was going to use conventional tactics. And we'll see how that works out for him against the Japanese. Whereas Mao and the Red Army and the CCP, they wanted to use guerrilla tactics, and they were more effective. I shouldn't say highly effective, effective in fighting the Japanese, but it actually won them a lot of popular support amongst the people because they were perceived as being more effective. So more people started favoring the CCP. So just to put that out there, that there is the second united front between the KMT and the CCP. It is mostly in name only because they actually did still kind of harass each other and fight. There's numerous instances of the KMT forcing the CCP to move to certain places to fight the Japanese, and they would actually attack them and vice versa. So it's not like this was a hunky-dory. We're going to put our differences aside. It was we hate each other and we're going to fight the Japanese and each other kind of thing.
Yeah. Yeah, there's still very much this competition over the hearts and minds of the Chinese people themselves. Mm-hmm. Colin, you talked about the Mandate of Heaven in one of our earlier episodes. Like all these different warlords, Mao for the CCP, Chiang Kai-shek, they're still competing for this Mandate of Heaven for legitimacy. So they had to put on this external front of like, we're all friends. We're fighting off the Japanese. And then they're like killing each other on the sides type deal because they're in competition with one another. So, yeah. So when the Japanese invade in 1937, there's somewhat of a united front, but Chiang Kai-shek is in a very difficult situation for sure.
Yeah. And I mean, just to think, literally, as soon as the Japanese were defeated, it was like almost as soon as that threat went away, they started fighting each other. They just declared war on each other and went all out. So yeah,
it's almost like the Middle East today. Not to go too far off track here, it's almost like the Middle East today. I remember during the Obama administration when ISIS was doing its thing in Iraq and in Syria, and the Russians were involved in Syria, and then there was the Assad regime in Syria, the Turks, the Israelis. Hezbollah, like all these other like militia groups that you don't hear about on the news because they change names and people die all the time. Like it is just this quagmire of competition and nominal alliances, and the U.S. is like, my head is spinning. That actually may have been worse than what was going on in 1937, but just to illustrate the point. All right, so let's actually tell the story of what happened in the first like 6-ish months of the second Sino-Japanese War. So we talked a little bit about what happened in the North. So let's talk about what happens on the East Coast in Shanghai. So due to some treaty concessions and things going on, in 1937, there was already a small contingent of Japanese military in Shanghai. Shanghai was not like a treaty port to the Japanese in the same way that like Hong Kong or Macau were. But there was already a Japanese contingent there in Shanghai because it was a treaty port, just not to one nation. It had been for quite some time. So Chiang Kai-shek orders his troops to kind of surround the Japanese and push them out. One thing that it's important to remember during this time was the Japanese did not intend to fully take over China. Rather, they were just trying to inflict enough pain on China, the KMT, etc., to get them to make further concessions. Japan was not trying to take over and annex all of China. Well, that's ridiculous. Everybody knew Japan was significantly smaller than China. There's no way they could have done that. So the Marco Polo Bridge Incident originally was just like, hey, we're going to take Beijing and Tianjin. We're going to get some more concessions. We're going to make everybody happy, and this will be over quickly. So there wasn't a ton of Japanese troops in Shanghai. There was just this defensive contingent. Well, Chiang Kai-shek was like, bump that. We're going to surround Shanghai. We're going to push the Japanese out of here. And we're going to take our country back. Well, Japan. So the standoff occurs for a month or two where Japan starts reinforcing its contingency in Shanghai. There's like these little intermittent skirmishes, and the KMT also starts reinforcing its positions around Shanghai. Well, like, all military buildups, when two opposing nations like start building up troops, they don't have to be shooting at one another. It's just the likelihood of conflict is significantly higher just by putting more people there. And, guess what? Fighting breaks out. And the Japanese ended up placing like some 200,000 troops in Shanghai. They bring a whole bunch of troops along the river there, and they start a full-scale assault. They very easily take over. I say relatively easy. They relatively easily take over Shanghai and kind of cut off, because Shanghai itself is on a somewhat of a peninsula. They take that peninsula that's flanked by two rivers, and then they kind of stop. Well, what they didn't expect was that the KMT was going to put up the resistance that they did. So there were a lot of Japanese that fought and died for the Battle of Shanghai. Well, what that did was that really pissed off some generals. And once they had taken Shanghai, the next big city is relatively nearby, and that was the capital city of the KMT, Nanking. For pronunciation's sake, Nanking, Nanjing, same place, depending on how you pronounce it and whatnot. But just because Iris Chang's book, The Rape of Nanking, is Nanking, I call it Nanking. Anyway, so they get the Imperial Japanese Army generals get pissed, and they decide, well, there's Nanking. We want China to surrender so we can get these concessions. We're just going to take over Nanking. And what ensued is one of the worst atrocities ever committed by any army of all time. I already mentioned Iris Chang wrote a book called The Rape of Nanking, because and it was called that shortly after awareness occurred. Like, it was bad. Go ahead.
Yeah, I read that book a couple of years ago. It is not for the faint of heart. It's not like light historical reading. It is. She pulled a lot of her research from like actual diaries of firsthand accounts of people that were in the city when this happened, and like Westerners that tried to set up a safe zone, an international safe zone within the city, which was like this just large area that they're like, and they had these different refugee camps. And basically the Chinese government was just like, hey, we're leaving, everybody get out of here, get out now, or go to the safe zone. And they taught, I think in the book, they estimate that like 20 to 60,000 women were like raped. And it wasn't just like young women or anything. It was just like women in general, pregnant women. And some of the atrocities that they committed were just terrible. I think they estimated up to 300,000 people died there. And to put in perspective, the city was only about 600,000 to 700,000 at the time. So it was like 50% of the people just died there in a matter of like 6 weeks. So terrible atrocities. And I definitely recommend that you go read the book. Just because it also, I think a lot of times at least with Western studies, we kind of tend to focus on Europe in World War II and the atrocities of the Germans, and then followed by the Russians, I guess, kind of. So we really overlook a lot of things like this. Like if you were to go to your average American and ask them about the rape of Nanking, they would have no idea what you're talking about. And it was brutal and bad. And actually, I think the Japanese general and some of his like lieutenants were all tried for war crimes afterward, and they were executed at a military tribunal. Yeah.
It really is. And that's kind of one of Chang's points in her book is like, we don't talk about the rape of Nanking, or it's also called the Nanking or Nanjing massacre, because rape is such a strong word. But like we don't talk about it, and it all goes back to when at the end of World War I or World War II, the United States took significant measures to actually not downplay, but to classify a lot of the war crimes that the Japanese had committed, because we were very concerned about stability in Japan. We were very concerned about trying to get Japan back on its feet, so to speak. This is why we left Hirohito in power. Fun fact, Emperor Hirohito, the guy that literally was in charge of Japan during all this, Pearl Harbor, World War II, he didn't die until the 1980s. He was still around. As a matter of fact, I should look this up. One of our listeners, please correct me if I'm wrong on this, but it was like I think it's his son, it's at least his descendant. He just relinquished the throne like a year or two ago. And there's now we're still in the Showa dynasty of Japan, so to speak. So the United States, we kept the Japanese version of the Nuremberg trials classified, and a lot of it was not declassified until the 70s or 80s or something like that. And because of that, a lot of the war crimes, to include Nanking, we don't know about it. We don't talk about it. And to Chinese today, that's a huge issue. It's like, you guys did some disgusting stuff to our people.
I think that's actually kind of an important point. So one of the key takeaways you had mentioned was how we have to sort of dance around these relations now, and kind of managing. And again, we talked about it last week, kind of too, where the U.S. is sort of like, hey, we got to navigate this very complex cultures. Well, now today you've got not just China and Japan, who have a very deep-seated distrust and sometimes outright dislike of each other, but you also have Korea and other Pacific nations, in former French Indochina, so Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, into Indonesia and the Philippines, where the Japanese did some very bad things in some of those areas. So we've got to kind of navigate hey, the Japanese are our friends now, and Korea, you're also our friend. And the Chinese kind of aren't, and the North Koreans aren't. How do we manage this? Because we're also doing business with China at the same time, but we're preparing our militaries to potentially fight them and defend you. So it's this very complex situation. And here's just a very, very small example. If you remember the 2018 Winter Olympics, there was it was a U.S. reporter for NBC, and he made kind of an innocuous comment. I don't think he really honestly knew the history, but he basically said South Koreans really look to Japan as an example for their economy. And the South Koreans were furious about that. There was an uproar, and NBC had to apologize, because during World War II, the Japanese soldiers would take what they called war wives in South Korea. And it is still a sore spot. So, 80 years later, here we are, and they're still upset about it. It is still deep-seated historical trauma that they're holding against the Japanese, to the point that they made this reporter, who had no idea and really had no reference to it, apologize for his insensitivity. So that's just a small example of what we're kind of navigating around out there because of events like this.
Yeah, even today in Japan, there is a conservative element and a more liberal element. And the conservative old guard of Japan, they in order to be a card-carrying member of the right in Japan, you basically have to deny Japanese war crimes during World War II. It's a super sensitive topic just within internal Japanese politics. For example, Shinzo Abe, who I still can't believe that dude was assassinated. That's just mind-blowing to me. Anyway, Shinzo Abe, the long-time prime minister of Japan, he was sharply criticized. There's a particular World War II memorial in Japan that commemorates like the dead of Japan. And if you go visit it as the prime minister, you're either a boy. What I mean is like on the, from the conservative faction's point of view, it's like, oh, you're one of our boys because you went to this and you paid your respects. And from the liberal faction, it's like, you're a monster. You're a war criminal. Like that memorial symbolizes all the bad things that we did during World War II. And not just that, the Koreans get upset and the Chinese get upset if the prime minister goes and visits this memorial. It's almost like cancel culture. It's like the Japanese version of cancel culture, in that if you acknowledge or don't acknowledge the war crimes in Japan, that puts you distinctly in a camp, and you will be demonized by the other side depending on which camp you fall into.
There's no way to win.
Yeah. Another thing, there's some academics in Japan who fight with Chinese academics on the exact number of people that were killed in Nanking. Like this is a huge debate even today. Like in the last 20 years, there's been significant argument over this.
I didn't realize that. That's a good point. When I was just kind of looking this up today, and it's not like it's this kind of fringe couple people online in a chat room. It's like there are Japanese scholars who literally would say it was impossible. It's all propaganda. This didn't come out till after the war. It was to embarrass Japan and really, put us down. And there's no way, if you do the math, it couldn't have been done. It was all propaganda. So it's a large sect of people in Japan that believe this. So it's kind of interesting.
Yeah. So real quick, let's talk about implications for international relations here, because one view is, well, the United States needs to pressure Japan to apologize. This was obviously really bad. And the United States needs to make Japan apologize. And this is a naive viewpoint. And here's why. Every country has dirty laundry. Every country has skeletons in their closet. And if we were all to try to pressure one another to feel some kind of moral repentance over past historical deeds, that's all we would ever do. And two, we could never get along with anybody. So generally speaking, as a rule, if you're a diplomat in a foreign country, you don't talk about that country's dirty laundry. Here's an example. In the 80s, during the Thatcher administration, right? The conservatives in the United States and the conservatives in Great Britain were buddy-buddy. You had Reagan, you had Thatcher, everything was fine between us. Well, one of the things that we don't talk about here in the United States is what the British were doing in Ireland, particularly in Northern Ireland during that time. And there was a low-key war going on in Northern Ireland. And you had the conservative British who were literally killing Irish people, and Irish people were killing British. It was bad. It was ugly.
It was insurgency.
If you go to Belfast today, there is a very real scar tissue over what was going on. And it wasn't just the 80s, but just to give an example, there were some questionable things that the Thatcher government was doing in Northern Ireland, and the U.S. wasn't saying anything because we were buddy-buddy and still remain to this day buddy-buddy with the Brits. Conversely, the United States has its own dirty laundry. I mean, you name it, everything. I mean, slavery is in the Civil War is the big one. But like even from a Japanese perspective, like during World War II in the internment camps, like we were literally rounding up Asian people because they were Asian and putting them in internment camps.
Yeah, I know. It's like, hey, sorry, Japan, we were also mistreating your people. And then with the Chinese, it was like, hey, by the way, we were really mistreating your people too, which was a sore spot for the Chinese today, because they look at the U.S. and say, you really mistreated our people who were in your country.
The point being is that we all have our dirty laundry, and like if the British were to come to us and say like, or no, even better, Japanese. If the Japanese were to come to us today and be like, hey, like you guys really mistreated, African Americans in slavery. We really think y'all should give them monetary reparations in 2022, 2023. I'm sure some Americans would be like, yeah, but then a lot of Americans would be like, you're freaking outside of your mind, right? And furthermore, who are you, Japan, to say that to us? So if, the United States were to go like, hey, Japan, like you guys really need to apologize to the Chinese, they'd probably look at us and have the exact same reaction. It would be, who the freak are you? Well, actually, in Japan, they'd be like, "Ah, thank you so much for your suggestion." Like, they'd probably be really polite about it. Now
they did give a really polite no.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure if the right guy, you'd probably really piss him off. But the point being is, with regards to U.S. and Chinese relations today, like this is a huge hurdle for third-party Americans to navigate this rape of Nanking and what the Japanese were doing during World War II. That has very real implications for today.
All right. So anyway, let's bring it back. So let's bring it back to what was going on. So the rape of Nanking happens. What happens, from here on out throughout the Sino-Japanese War?
All right. So it's 1937 going into 1938. And essentially from here until 1941, you get increasing measures by the Roosevelt administration to alienate Japan and begin informally severing ties. It's important to note that this is done by the Roosevelt administration. So in 1931, I believe the Hoover administration was in office. We didn't really do much more than slap Japan on the wrist in 1931. In 1935, the Roosevelt administration was in office, but we are deep in the throes of the Great Depression. There is no appetite, politically speaking, to really try to strong-arm anybody. The number one priority for the Roosevelt administration is to get us out of the Great Depression. However, in 1937, we're still not quite out of the Great Depression, but things are a lot better. And the Roosevelt, or FDR in particular, he was a new breed of Democrat who had a lot stronger appetite for interventionism. It's kind of funny because looking at the rest of the 20th century for the United States, it really was Democrats who were, who leaned interventionists, and Republicans have always kind of been more isolationist. You had, Kennedy and LBJ kind of getting us involved in Vietnam. That's just one more example. Obviously, there's exceptions to the rule. Eisenhower kind of did some things prior to Kennedy. There were two different Taiwan Strait crises that Roosevelt put carriers in the Taiwan Strait. You had the both Bush administrations that were doing things in Iraq. So yes, like Republicans can be interventionist, but generally speaking, painting big, broad brush strokes here, Republicans tend to be more isolationist. Democrats tend to be more interventionist. And a lot of that is because of FDR, as the example of FDR as a Democrat began pushing this interventionism in World War II. So one of the neat things, well, I don't know if neat's the right word, but one of the things that doesn't get taught in American history textbooks is how Roosevelt simultaneously pushed these neutrality acts, which was a declaration that we would not give war material, either what we now call lethal aid, like guns and tanks and planes and ships, ammunition, as opposed to what we call non-lethal aid, which could be anything from like helmets and protection to like supplies, like at this time, steel or oil. A lot of this stuff was big. So we signed these neutrality acts around the same time, 36, 37, 38, that basically said the United States was not going to give war material, either lethal or non-lethal, to a country during a state of war. Well, simultaneously, Roosevelt was a little bit more aggressive in trying to pressure Japan to get out of China. So what he did was he found this loophole was, Japan had not declared war against China. Therefore, there is no state of war between Japan and China right now. And I can therefore do trade as usual. I'm doing air quotes, trade as usual here during this time. And I can give the Chinese anything that they want.
That's an amazing loophole, by the way.
Yeah, it's like they're not at war right now. Therefore, I'm not violating the neutrality acts. I bring this up to...
It's a war in every sense of the word, but It's not on paper.
There's not a legal state of war. Therefore, I'm not legally violating the neutrality acts. It's really funny how this works out, because we're doing similar but different things in Ukraine today. Like, the United States has always been an economic powerhouse. We are still the world's largest economy. China is not even close. I love talking this because I really do love the United States. I forget how many. I want to say the United States economy by measure of GDP is the same size as like the next 5 or 6 combined. And that includes China. Like, everybody freaks out about like, China's this rise. Yes, they are a rising power. Like, yes, they need to, we need to work well with them, etc. But like, we forget how much of an economic powerhouse the United States is, and it's not even close. Number two is China. Number 3 is Japan. I want to say number 4 is Germany.
It is Germany. Yeah.
Yeah. And after that, I forget. But like, we're literally bigger than all of those economies combined.
Yeah. So just to throw some hard numbers out there, we make up about 24% of the world's economy, almost 25%.
A quarter.
And, China's about 12%. So we're just under, because it's like 19 trillion and then they're about 12 trillion. I think the scary thing, to your point, is not so much where they're at now, but their general average GDP growth is about 6.9%, and ours is only about 2 to 3. But then it's like India, United Kingdom, France, and it just kind of falls off from there. Back to your point. Sorry.
And well, even to compare the GDP growth, be like, their GDP is growing at a much, double the rate ours is. Like, yeah, but they would have to sustain that for decades to catch up with us, because, just to make this super simple, this is not proportional, but just to illustrate the point, if the United States has $100 and earns 1% every year, we're making $1 every year, right? If Japan has $1 and makes 1% a year, they're not making $1. They're making a cent. It would take them 100 years to make the same amount of money that the United States was making at that same time.
We'll get into compound interest, though. But
But to the point, like, it is not a given that China can continue 6% growth indefinitely. As a matter of fact, there's a whole lot of assumptions being made. Like, one, you have to accept the 6% figure because
I was going to say, you have to accept what the China, because a lot of those numbers have been hidden if you've been paying attention, and there's a lot there's a lot of financial organizations like what was that one called? Anyway, the CCP basically props up a lot of failing businesses. There's a lot of scrutiny about the big bailout that occurred in the U.S. banks. The CCP by policy does that to Evergrande. That's it. Evergrande right now is like defaulted. They're a huge driver behind the Chinese real estate market, which is part of what is fueling their current growth. And the CCP is absolutely bailing them out so they do not default anymore because they owe a lot of people money, a lot of foreign countries money. And it would look very badly on the CCP if everyone realized that, their real estate market is so overvalued that they have fake cities, or empty cities that are only occupied by about 10% of, it's only 10% occupancy. I'm getting way ahead of that. That's like a current state thing, but you're right. The assumption of the
it's the loins of history.
The assumption of 6.9%. It like we go through these different things. Like that's assuming, like I think it's 2050-ish that they think that they'll pass us, but that's assuming that it is continued growth and some cataclysmic event doesn't occur, which through the lens of history, we've seen that they occur all the time. There's major setbacks and problems that occur all the time.
Yeah, no, as a matter of fact, I personally believe that like it feels like 2020 was 1929 or 1930, like significant tectonic event just rocked the globe, created a period of instability, and like this isn't going to be over anytime soon, folks. I don't know what that looks like. I really hope it doesn't look like, continued plagues and wars and instability. Like I would love for this to kind of just all blow over and we go back to, 1991 and everything's all hunky dory. But it just doesn't feel that way. Like it's not a guarantee that things are going to get better. Like China is increasingly aggressive. Like if you look at the last party Congress that occurred in October, you can draw a lot of parallels between that party Congress and the current trajectory of the CCP to Imperial Japan during this time. Like it just looks similar. It doesn't mean that Japan or China is going to freaking invade any other country besides Taiwan, but nevertheless, like you get this trajectory of revanchism where they feel like they have a chip on their shoulder. It is not good when countries feel like they have a chip on their shoulder. And Japan had a chip on their shoulder during this time. China has a chip on their shoulder at this time. Russia's got a huge chip on their shoulder at this time. Whereas Germany had a chip on their shoulder in World War II. So like, it's just not a good look. And things, I don't know what the future holds, but we have to learn what happened in this time to try to make sure that it doesn't happen.
I think
again, for sure.
I really think that was a good point to bring up, that like 2020, like it was very different. It's different causes, obviously, different symptoms, some different effects immediately after. But you're right. There are some tectonic shifts that create instability. And the thing about instability, and it creates a vacuum. Power hates a vacuum. In geopolitics, something is going to fill that void. And it's going to be interesting to see, there's the BR, was it the BRICS payment system that's being formed, kind of almost like a new axis. And this, for a long time, the U.S. has enjoyed this sheer hegemony over the rest of the world. And that's kind of going away with BRICS, because it's like the Russians, the Chinese, and a lot of other countries are sort of teaming up to say, well, the thing that you have, the most power you have in your economy, we're going to try and take away as much as we can and build our own. So it's this sort of multipolar state. It's almost creating like a kind of a second Cold War type of feel. That's sort of how I see it. It's like we may not go into a world war, but we're definitely going to have this. There's China, Russia over here. There's the U.S. and its allies over here. And like we may not, tensions are going to be high between the two of us, and there's going to be a lot of little proxy wars like Ukraine being fought all over the place, potentially. But who knows? We'll see.
So, no, listening to you talk, there's no telling what it's going to look like in the future. It could be a major conventional war, like, maybe not World War II, because World War II is just massive, studying all of global history for 2,000 years. Like World War II was like off the charts. So the likelihood of something like World War II happening again, I would consider it low. But that doesn't mean that there won't be like more localized conflicts where a lot of people die. A lot of times, and this is, I guess, I want to distinguish ourselves from some of the doom and gloom that the media loves reporting now, because the media likes reporting doom and gloom, and they like fear mongering for fear mongering's own sake, because that's what gets people to pay attention, right?
It's profitable.
But, right, this is the loins of history, all right? I do not want to fearmonger for the sake of fearmongering. Rather, as a matter of fact, the whole reason why this podcast exists is so that we learn, so that we can prevent the bad things from happening. For example, right now, I think I can safely say the U.S. and China our current trajectory is conflict. And I mean like bullets flying. It's just like, this is how history works, folks. Like you have two major powers that are beefing over issues. There is no obvious resolution in sight. China, as the quote unquote underdog in this scenario, like they have something to prove. Like I said, they have a chip on their shoulder. The United States is not in a position where it's going to back down. Like we are on the path to conflict. I do not want that to happen because people die. I mean, look, we didn't talk about this, and we're running out of time, but like in an effort to stop the Japanese invasion, the Chinese like busted the dikes that hold the Yellow River in. And for all of, the millennia of Chinese history, the Yellow River flooding like kills hundreds of thousands of people. And I was reading when the Chinese blew the dikes.
Go ahead.
Huh?
Yeah, keep going. I was going to say it happened during
when the Chinese
Rebellion.
blew the dikes that the Yellow River flooded. Yeah. Well, when they blew the dikes in the Second Sino-Japanese War, like some 200,000 people died. Like Chinese people died. Not Japanese. We're not talking about, God and Moses parting the Red Sea and the Egyptians walking into it and like, everybody's fine and only the Egyptians died. That's not what happened. It was, we have to flood the Yellow River to prevent the Japanese from coming any further. And they killed 200,000 of their own people. Another example, just to illustrate the point here, during the Korean War, when the North Koreans invaded, Seoul is north of the major river. I cannot remember off the top of my head the name of this river. Somebody tell me, but in the comments. But the U.S. military was there, and you have tons of refugees trying to get south, trying to escape from the North Korean onslaught. And there was like I want to say it was some U.S. Army like major, or maybe he's like a lieutenant colonel or colonel, I forget, but like he literally like had his thumb on the dynamite to blow all the bridges to stop the North Koreans. And their T.R. Fehrenbach's This Kind of War is the best book on the Korean War, and he talks about this. One reason why I love Fehrenbach's book is he's angry the whole book. It's just, he's angry. He's definitely grinding an axe, and I love it. Anyway, this U.S. Army guy had to blow the bridges at a certain time, and those bridges were chocked full of Korean civilians. Estimated some 10,000 Koreans died on the bridge. Not like they got stuck in Seoul, just some 10,000 human beings made in the image of God died, exploded, drowned, were torn to bits through flame and concussion. folks, war sucks. War is not good. And we have got to learn these lessons so that this stuff doesn't happen. So like the fear mongering is not like, listen more to the Lords of History. The fear mongering is like, we desperately need good people to figure it out and stop this nonsense. Anyway, sorry. That's my rant.
Is it the Han River? First off, that was a great rant. I'm going to say that was a great rant. Very powerful. Is it the Han River you're talking about that kind of divides?
That sounds right. Yeah.
I think it's the Han River. I think one of the telltale signs of a coming conflict is where countries start to insulate themselves from being isolated. And what I mean by that is, if you remember, the Japanese were getting some like 80% of their oil from the U.S. And when when Roosevelt cut ties, they were like, okay, we're going to go get oil from somewhere else. Like they were basically like, okay, if we do this, the U.S. cuts this off from us. We've got to go find it elsewhere. And we're going to do that. And we have plans to do that. It's kind of like now with the U.S. and the Chinese. It's like the U.S. is like, well, if we lose Taiwan, the semiconductor industry, which is where we have computers, everything we thrive on now in our modern economy is built. We need to invest in making it here in the U.S. We need to bring the supply chain back to the U.S., whereas the Chinese are like, hey, we need to figure out how to buy oil, not in dollars. Hey, we need a payment system, not in dollars, because if the event happens where we go to war, we don't want to be cut off. And you can kind of see, if you read the signs, you're like, okay, well, the Germans and the Japanese started doing these things where they were isolating themselves and pulling themselves away from the international community. That's kind of like a telegraph, or they're telegraphing what they're going to do. Looking back, okay, the Japanese knew they're going to lose oil. They have plans to go get it somewhere else. Right now,
yep.
I'm looking at the rhymes. It doesn't repeat, but it rhymes.
Right. Yeah. Nations begin hardening their economies when they believe conflict is inevitable. Either they think they're going to get attacked or they plan on attacking somebody else. Yeah. And oil production, just like World War II, then and now, is a huge, aspect to this kind of stuff. And China is just as concerned about oil as Japan was in World War II. And on that note, just to try to wrap it up here, because I want to try to get us to 1941. Long story short, is the Roosevelt administration begins giving foreign aid. It wasn't called Lend-Lease at this time because the Lend-Lease Act doesn't get passed until 1941. But we were giving material aid to the Chinese, and we were cutting off the Japanese. The final straw. So the Japanese invade, they take over a whole bunch of different ports. The final straw for the United States was in 1940, World War II from a European perspective kicks off in 1939 in September with the Nazi invasion of Poland. Great Britain, France, Germany, Poland all declare war on one another. And in 1940, that's the fall of France, and you now have Vichy France and the Free French government. Well, Indochina was nominally still controlled by Vichy France, Indochina being now the countries of Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, all controlled by France. Vichy France, by being a puppet government of the Nazis, is now friendly with the Japanese, and the Japanese make an offer and say, hey, we want to take over first northern Indochina and then later all of Indochina. The U.S. government, the Roosevelt administration, saw these advances as just further Japanese aggression. They saw the Japanese getting closer and closer to Guam, closer and closer to the Philippines, and Roosevelt was like, that's it, final straw. So when the Japanese move into Indochina, Roosevelt signs an executive order that essentially freezes all Japanese assets in the United States. This is the de facto oil embargo that people talk about. If Japan can't make any purchases because all your money is frozen in U.S. banks in the United States, you can't buy any oil from American businesses, and therefore you've been embargoed. And he did this via executive order. So that happened, I believe, in July of 1941. That was the final straw. That was when I'm pretty sure I'd have to read At Dawn We Slept Again. But the Japanese planning to attack Pearl Harbor actually occurred before this, like a few months prior to. That's when Yamamoto was making his plans to do Pearl Harbor. We could do a whole episode on Yamamoto, by the way. That dude's a fascinating character. Very familiar with the United States, actually partially educated in the United States, knew exactly what he was getting himself into. He was the main architect behind Pearl Harbor, even though he's kind of seen as this noble villain by the United States, generally admired by Americans, even though he's literally the reason why Pearl Harbor happened. And this oil embargo was like, all right, that's it. We have to, if we can't get oil from the United States, we have to get oil elsewhere. The closest place for oil is the Dutch and British colonies in Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, also significant amounts of rubber there. And in order to successfully take over that, we need to do preemptive strikes against the Philippines, Guam, Wake Island, and Pearl Harbor. So that gets us to 1941. The United States, and I think it's important, especially for all of our American listeners, to understand, like, kind of trying to bring this full circle. The whole reason why Japan attacked Pearl Harbor was because of China. Like, the United States had been doing more increasing aggressive measures trying to get Japan to pull out of China. Japan couldn't do that from their perspective. So they're like, it's inevitable. We have to go to war with the United States. And it was just one more fallacy of like, we have to end this war quickly type deal. By the way, military folks, just fun fact, if you ever think to yourself, whether you're Russian, American, you name it, if you ever think to yourself, we can end this war quickly, you cannot end this war quickly.
The war will be over by Christmas.
The war will not be over by Christmas. You're going to get yourself into more trouble than you originally planned. You are not that good. The war will not. Even the Germans, people are like, well, the Germans defeated the Poles and the French. It's like, yeah, and they got them, like, they lost.
They lost. World War quite the quagmire.
They got themselves
World War I. They're like the Schlieffen plan. We have 6. I think they said they're like, we have 6 weeks or like 72 days. I can't remember exactly how it was, but like they had this timeline. They're like, if we miss this by a day, we will lose. Like it'll turn into this. It'll turn into this quagmire.
Sorry, folks. We have kids. It's fine.
It'll turn into a quagmire, and we'll lose. Like, even they were like, I think the Japanese kind of had the same mentality. They're like, we have to strike now, strike hard. We have to win it immediately. Otherwise, it'll turn into this long drawn out war, and we will lose if it's drawn out.
For every example of a war ending quickly, there are 10 other examples where wars did not end quickly. Yeah.
I think that puts the U.S. kind of, at least like from a public perception kind of thing. Like, we always think Desert Storm, like 100 hours of conflict. 100 hours of conflict is an aberration. Like, that doesn't happen, and I don't think it would happen.
No. So, yes, the conventional aspect, 100 hours of conflict, but would 2003 have occurred if 1991 or 1990 hadn't occurred?
If
we also forget. We also forget. Somebody was telling me about, I think it was Outkast or maybe Andre 3000 wrote a song called "Bombs Over Baghdad" in the 90s.
Great song.
Or maybe it was in the 80s. I forget. Anyway, we still bombed Iraq after Desert Storm because we were trying to protect the Kurds. So it's like, 100 hours of conflict. It was in
2000.
In 2000 when we bombed.
No, that's when the song came out.
Oh, Yeah, because prior to that, probably in the 90s, we were still bombing Iraq before 2003. Yeah, Desert Storm was this quick, like very decisive, quote unquote, victory. But how much of a victory was it? Like,
we were there in less than 15 years.
Yeah, and we're
still there. Yeah, and then we have to occupy it. Yeah, still there.
We're still there. We still very much care about what's going on in Baghdad right now. Yeah, wars do not end quickly. Heck, when World War I ended, it did not end. if you want to draw the continuity between World War I and World War II. The Peloponnesian War. Oh man, I love all these different cross references. If you read Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War, there were technically two different wars with a Sicilian expedition in between. And I think Thucydides was right to kind of draw them all together into one single conflict because there was a continuity, even though I forget how many, it's like 4 or 5 years where the Spartans and the Athenians technically weren't at war with one another in the middle. Like, wars do not end quickly, folks.
Nor do they generally end well. The Peloponnesian reference, what happened? Athens lost its money and its navy. Sparta was drained of its resources, and then they were taken over shortly thereafter by the Macedonians.
That's right.
Weird.
Yeah, and the Thebans somewhat before that.
Interesting that we've drawn parallels to the Peloponnesian War and the Second Sino-Japanese War.
Yeah, we didn't even mention Russian-Ukraine right now. There's just so much. All right, just so to recap before we close out here. Continuing U.S.-Chinese relations, huge shift occurs in 1937. The United States, we've been talking. The open door policy went from all talk to starting to have tangible measures under the Roosevelt administration to really back up the open door policy. And that ultimately led us to Pearl Harbor in 1941. Japan attacked the United States because of the United States trying to defend China, starting in 1937. So for our next episode, we're gonna continue the thread. We're gonna continue talking about World War II. We're gonna continue talking about how the communists were involved in the beef between Mao and Chiang Kai-shek, and how they're still fighting with one another even during World War II. So,
I'm definitely looking forward to talking about like they called it like the CBI, the China, Burma, India kind of front of World War II. Yeah. I feel like it's very overlooked. We always think of the island hopping and fighting the Japanese, but there was conflict that occurred in China, Burma, and India. And if you've ever seen the movie The Bridge Over the River Kwai, great movie. Yep. But it's a whole front of that campaign and that theater of conflict that we don't talk about a lot. And I think we're gonna bring a lot of that in.
Yeah, it's the Pacific Theater in World War II is fascinating. World War II there's just so much. Love World War II.
We'll try and get some of it next week. But Jay, thanks for that summary, and thanks for taking us through this episode. Folks, if you like what we're doing here at the Loins of History, you're enjoying what we're talking about, we love getting feedback. We love hearing from our fans, our listeners, any constructive or not so constructive feedback if you have it. We love to hear it. So please follow us on social media, reach out to us that way. We like interacting with anybody that listens to us. And if you do also enjoy it, give us a 5-star rating on whether you're listening on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or Podcast Addict. We love that. It helps us get the word out. It really alters the algorithm and moves us to the front of the line, or the top of the queue, if you will. So appreciate it. Thank you for listening, and hope you enjoyed. We'll see you next week.